Well, I think, Carrie, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started.
Okay.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to DHR's virtual workshop on the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund Grant Program. We are going to get started with the presentation. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the session. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat during the presentation and we can address those at the end. Or you can also use the raise hand icon if you would prefer to ask your questions directly. My colleague Carrie Richardson is going to help me moderate the questions, and we'll again try our best at the end to get those questions answered. And I guess I would ask too, if you're not on mute, could you please make sure to mute your microphone? So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Wendy Musumeci, and I am the Easement Program Coordinator at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. In addition to negotiating new easements, I am also now the primary administrator of the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund. This is the first time we're offering a workshop about this grant program. It's also the first time we're using Microsoft Teams to do this presentation, so bear with us, please, if we have any technical difficulties. I should note that we are recording the session and transcribing it, just so you're aware of that. Normally, we would offer to host a grant workshop after the grant round opens, but since this is a transition year for the program, we've decided to hold the workshop in advance of the grant round. I intend to broadly cover the history of the fund, how DHR administers the program, the 2023 grant round specifically, and the new application form that we've developed. As a bit of a disclaimer, the materials presented today are for informational purposes and may not comprehensively reflect all the grant program requirements. So we do encourage you to carefully read the grant manual and the associated documents when they are released before you submit your application. And as I mentioned previously, for any of those who've joined late, we are going to have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to ask any questions in the chat function or use the raised hand icon when we get to the end. I want to begin by providing a very brief overview of the origins of the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund and how it has developed. The fund began in 2006. Initially, the Virginia Appropriations Act set out funding, which was allocated on a yearly basis. The fund was not formally codified into Virginia Code until 2010, and it was first known as the Civil War Sites Preservation Fund. The scope of the program was expanded in 2015 to include Revolutionary War and War of 1812 battlefields, in addition to Civil War battlefields. And at that time, the fund was also renamed the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund. Established in Virginia Code Section 10.1-2202.4, the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund is a non-reverting fund. Its purpose is to award competitive grants to nonprofit organizations for the fee simple acquisition of or acquisition of an easement on Virginia battlefield properties. This includes Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and Civil War battlefields. The fund is administered by the Department of Historic Resources, which is charged with creating guidelines for applications, evaluations, and the award of grants from the fund. Throughout its history, the fund has been managed by various program areas within DHR. Initially, it started out in the director's office and then our community services division. And most recently, administration of the fund was moved to the easement program, which is within the Preservation Incentives Division. The easement program we'll work directly with our administrative division as well as the director's office to administer and make disbursements from the fund. We think moving the fund to the easement program is a good fit because there's a strong link between the easement program and the battlefield fund requirement that a perpetual easement be placed on any land acquired or protected with monies from the fund. I just wanted to also provide you all with some really basic statistics on the program. Since 2006, we have awarded over 130 grants, ranging from $16,000 all the way to $800,000. Just over $20 million in grant funds have been allocated, perpetually protecting more than 10,000 acres of Virginia battlefield land. So as I previously noted, DHR is responsible for administration of the fund. However, the enabling legislation that I referenced a few slides earlier really lays out the framework for how the fund is structured. There are 4 basic elements to the program. Grants may be awarded to registered nonprofit charitable corporations for either the fee simple acquisition of land or acquisition of a historic preservation open space easement on land. Importantly, the land must be within the designated boundaries of a Revolutionary War, War of 1812, or Civil War battlefield, as identified in 2 separate federal reports, which I'll get into a little bit more detail on later. And finally, matching funds, dollar for dollar matching funds are required. So eligible applicants must be registered nonprofit charitable corporations declared exempt from taxation pursuant to Chapter 26, Section 501c3 of the United States Code. Applicants to the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund must submit a letter from the IRS verifying their 501c3 status, as well as proof of registration with the Virginia State Corporation Commission and a certificate of existence / good standing, similar to the one shown here on the slide. Eligible projects. There are only 2 eligible project types: fee simple acquisition or acquisition of an easement. I have listed here some examples of ineligible projects, just to give you a sense of what would not be covered, and that includes restoration or rehabilitation of the battlefield landscape to day of battle conditions, demolition and removal of non-historic buildings, interpretation or planning projects, or material stabilization of buildings and structures. Applicants must demonstrate that the owner is willing to sell the subject property or convey an easement on it. Prior acquisitions are permitted, provided they occurred no more than 12 months prior to the application deadline. And I should say that's prior acquisitions of land in fee simple. So this year's cutoff is going to be August 1st, 2022, and that is because the deadline for the grant applications will be August 1st, 2023. So that 12-month look back period gets us to August 1st, 2022. Applications for properties already permanently protected for conservation purposes are not eligible for a Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund grant unless the property can be further protected by a more restrictive easement. The grant amount would be dependent on the value of the enhanced protections. Eligible properties include those identified in either the report to Congress on the historic Revolutionary War and War of 1812 sites in the United States. This report was published in 2007 by the American Battlefield Protection Program. It is available on the National Park Service's data store website, and I have a link here and I will share this PowerPoint with you all after today. But if you look up National Park Service Data Store and look for the name of the report, you will find it. The second report that we reference is the report on the nation's Civil War battlefields, and that was done by the Civil War Sites Advisory Commission in 1993. Importantly, and this is new, for the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund, at least 50% of the property's acreage must be within the boundaries of the battlefield as defined in one of these two reports. And if you're not certain whether a specific property falls within the boundaries of a given battlefield, please reach out to me, or you can also reach out to our archives division. And when we release our grant manual, there will be contact information for the archives division as well. But I'm also happy to field any questions about whether a property, a given property is eligible, if you have any. In commemoration of the upcoming 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, and that's in 2026, DHR has decided to prioritize Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund projects that include acquisition and protection of Revolutionary War battlefields. This will be accomplished through additional points in the scoring rubric. Prioritization of American Revolutionary War sites supports the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission, which was established by the General Assembly in 2020 to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Listed on this slide are all the Virginia battlefields and associated historic properties that are identified in that 2007 ABPP report that I just discussed on the prior slide. And all of these would potentially be eligible for a Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund grant. With regard to eligible expenses, the legislation also clarifies what's eligible, and obviously the acquisition of the land and any associated improvements and the acquisition of a perpetual easement are eligible costs. However, costs associated with the acquisition are also eligible, and that includes appraisals, environmental reports, boundary surveys, archaeological surveys, title searches or title insurance, and closing costs. Ineligible expenses are often connected with ineligible projects, and those include indirect costs such as staff time, overhead, or work provided pro bono, costs for maintenance, operation, development, rehabilitation, or interpretation, and costs for improvements or facilities. All recipients of a Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund grant must provide at least $1 in matching funds for every $1 in grant funds received. Matching funds can be cash and the value of any contribution from a bargain sale or donation of land or interest in land made by a property owner. Importantly, and this is somewhat unique to this grant program, other state funds cannot be used as match. Grants cannot exceed 50% of the appraised value of the land and its improvements or the value of the easement interest acquired. And award recipients will need to provide an appraisal report to substantiate the value. Most typically, with regard to match, most often we see match funding from the American Battlefield Protection Program, the federal program that's also known as BLAG, or the Battlefield Land Acquisition Grant Program. For all projects, a perpetual easement over the subject property must be conveyed to the Virginia Board of Historic Resources. Easements held by the board are administered by staff at the Department of Historic Resources. The legislation does lay out a framework for holders other than the board, And in these instances, the terms and conditions of the easement must be reviewed by DHR to ensure it accomplishes the perpetual preservation of the property. And the other holder also has to demonstrate that it has the capacity and expertise to manage and enforce the terms of the easement. I just wanted to take a moment to note that the primary purpose of the easement will be to comprehensively protect the historic resources on the property. The easements in our program prioritize historic conservation values such as the architectural, archaeological, cultural, battlefield, or landscape qualities of a property. But there are many other important conservation values that could be identified and protected in the easement, such as those associated with water quality, natural heritage resources, forests, agricultural properties, or open space land. The list on this slide is not all encompassing, but kind of gives you an idea of the types of resources that may be present on a given property. And DHR and the types of resources DHR will also seek to protect in the easement. And as an example, I've just noted a 35-foot wide vegetated riparian buffer must be maintained along a perennial river, stream, or body of water, and livestock must be excluded. So that's just an example of a restriction for an additional conservation value beyond the historic battlefield that we may ask the grant recipient to also protect in the easement. Scoring and evaluation. Again, the legislation really drives the primary scoring criteria, and it highlights what's important, and we take that into consideration as we develop our scoring rubric. In general, this includes the significance of the battlefield and the degree to which the property falls within the core and study areas of a specific battlefield. How close is that property to other protected lands, threats to the integrity and features of the property that are associated with the battle in question, the financial and administrative capacity of the applicant to complete the project, and also the capacity of the applicant to maintain and manage the property, consistent with what the legislation terms public investment and public interest, such as education, recreation, research, heritage tourism, and orderly community development. So what does all that mean? We've tried to kind of dig deep into those requirements that are laid out in the legislation, and to some degree this year tweak our questions in our application and in our scoring to more similarly parallel those criteria that are laid out in the legislation. So in general, our scoring rubric identifies primary criteria, again, which includes the significance of the battlefield as designated in those battlefield reports. And as I mentioned, we are going to be giving priority to projects that protect Revolutionary War battlefields. We'll look at the percentage of the property that falls within either the core or study areas of the primary battlefield, the degree of integrity or level of preservation of the battlefield landscape, what are the identified threats to the property and its landscape, its adjacency to other protected or conserved lands, the extent to which the property is going to be made available for public use, and also the extent to which it will support public interests in education, research, recreation, tourism, and community development. We also look at whether or not the property has resources with special historic significance to a specific group or community. And again, that would be resources that are greater than 50 years old. We will look at the proportion of the cash match that's greater than 50% of the total project costs, and the financial and administrative capacity of the applicant to maintain and manage the property, consistent with battlefield preservation. There are also some secondary criteria that we do look at, and one of those is project readiness. And what we're looking for here is that the project has a high likelihood of success and it's ready for implementation. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but new this year is that we are asking that the applicant to the Battlefield Grant Program have previously applied to DHR's easement program. And that is to ensure, one, that the project is ready for implementation, and two, to make sure that the grant program is aware of any issues that need to be resolved related to recordation of that required perpetual easement. We also will look at the extent to which the property meets the Department of Conservation and Recreation 7 Conserve Virginia priorities. We will look at the additional historic significance of the property, such as whether it's listed in the Virginia Landmarks Register. We will look at other conservation values, the applicant's plans for stewardship of the property, again, the extent to which legal, title, or other issues need to be resolved. And some of this also feeds into what we call a qualitative analysis, where we focus on the benefit of the project to the Commonwealth, and again, consider some factors such as the public benefit and community impact. So the scoring rubric itself generally roughly stays the same, and then there are minor adjustments that are made to accommodate any priorities for a given grant round, as well as any changes to administration of the program that may impact the overall scoring. And finally, this list identifies some of the items and steps that will be necessary to complete before the grant is closed out. And again, this may not necessarily be comprehensive, but I've tried to pull out some of the key points and highlights. There will need to be a signed grant agreement. We need confirmation of match. The easement will need to be approved by the Virginia Board of Historic Resources. We are going to be asking for the applicant or the grant recipient to be submitting progress reports. We will need that property or easement appraisal that meets certain standards. And in conjunction with the easement program, the grant recipient is going to need to obtain a current physical boundary survey of the property, and then a title insurance policy that ensures the Board of Historic Resources easement interest. Projects must be completed, including recordation of the required easement, within 3 years from the date of the grant agreement. And grant funds for incomplete projects will revert back to the fund, and one 12-month administrative extension may be granted. So the current opportunity, and this is where I will talk about the 2023 grant round that's coming up. As I've mentioned, we are going to prioritize those Revolutionary War battlefields, and we are prioritizing project readiness, and that primarily is through the easement application form that has to be submitted and reviewed by our easement acceptance committee prior to your submitting the grant application. And the more easement acceptance committee reviews you've gone through, and even if you have board approval, that will likely impact your project readiness score. We're not weighting that too heavily, but we are looking again at to fund projects that are ready to go in terms of the easement reviews and the necessary steps that need to be taken for that. I previously mentioned that for fee simple acquisitions, no applications can be accepted for projects that closed prior to August 1st, 2022. And no more than 2 applications may be submitted for the same property, throughout multiple grant rounds. This year, we also have a new application form. We will have an updated manual There will be a new grant agreement. As I mentioned, we're also going to be more formally requiring progress reports and offering feedback sessions if for any reason you submit an application and your project does not get funded and you want to talk about that, we'll be happy to do that. So the 2023 grant round, there is $1.5 million in total grant funds that are available. There's no minimum or maximum award amount. And depending on the given round and the number of projects, we have sometimes offered partial funding for a project. And I've included here the calendar for the upcoming grant round. And today, May 2nd, is our virtual grant workshop. The grant round will formally open on June 1st. And at that time, we'll release the updated application form and the grant manual. And I also put in here June 16th and July 17th as important dates that have to do with the easement application that you're required to submit, and the easement acceptance committee that also needs to review that application. And because this is a transition year, we've been trying to, in all of our communications and our emails, trying to make you all aware of these upcoming deadlines, but there now is only one more easement acceptance committee meeting remaining before the grant application would be due. And so that meeting is scheduled for July 17th, and the deadline to have the application in for that meeting is June 16th. So those are some important dates to be aware of as you coordinate timing of your grant application with the easement application. And please reach out to me if you have any concerns or questions about that specifically. So the grant applications will be released June 1st, and then they will be due by close of business on August 1st. Our plan would be to announce the awards in September, hopefully not October, but I put that in there as tentative, and then get started signing those grant agreements in October. For those of you not familiar with the easement or the not familiar with the intricacies of the easement application process, I wanted to quickly here just sort of provide you with an overview of the steps that are required in that process. And initially you have to submit that application form, and that has to be submitted 30 days prior to a meeting. And then at the first easement acceptance committee meeting, the committee will consider whether your project meets the threshold criteria for the easement program. And they will also identify any issues that need to be addressed. So the first two steps on this slide, the application is submitted and the first easement acceptance committee review need to absolutely happen before you can submit your grant application. The remaining steps on this slide, the second easement acceptance committee review and the Board of Historic Resources meeting, those aren't required to happen before you submit your grant application. It would be great if your project has already gone through the remaining steps in the easement donation process. But I just wanted to lay this out a little bit more clearly, and I'll provide our contact information at the end, but please, again, reach out to Carrie or myself if you have questions or have concerns about the timing of this process, particularly since this is a new requirement for the grant program this year. So the application form has been substantively revised since prior grant rounds. I want to walk through the various elements and drill down on some specific questions, particularly those that are new or those that in the past we've seen some difficulty with some applicants in sort of getting at the answers we're looking for. So this application form that I'm going to walk through with you today hasn't been finalized, but it's pretty close So we will release that officially on June 1st. There may be some changes in what I show you now compared to what gets released on June 1st. But I think at this point, any changes will be fairly minimal. So this hopefully will give you a good idea of what the content of that application will be. So the application is divided into sections. The first page requests basic information about the project, the property, and the applicant. There are also 3 narrative form questions on this page. We ask for a summary description of the project, why the property is important to your organization, and we ask you to describe the project location. And I've provided some example answers here to give you a sense of what we're looking for. So in your summary description, the example we've provided here says the Eastern Battlefield Trust requests a grant to partially fund its acquisition of the 85-acre Dogwood Tract. This property is within the core and study areas of the 1st and 2nd Dogwood battlefields. Both battlefields are documented United States colored troop sites important to African American and Civil War history. A grant would allow the Eastern Battlefield Trust to preserve this land and provide for public access through installation of interpretive signage and trails. And so what we're looking for here is just something concise, fairly short, that describes your project that we can also use if we are working any press releases or grant announcements and we need a summary. The other narrative question on the form here that's new is to explain why this specific battlefield property is important to your organization and its partners. And as an example answer, we've given acquisition of this property will create a continuous 250-acre corridor of protected battlefield landscape that's owned by the Eastern Battlefield Trust. It's consistent with our mission to implement large landscape scale conservation projects. It's also the last unprotected piece of open space land on the Dogwood battlefield. What's really important here for us is to know why the particular property that is the subject of this application is important for your organization, and broadly how that fits in with your larger mission and goals. And last, the last narrative question here is to describe the project location. Generally, I think this question has been on the application form before, and we usually get pretty good answers, but I've provided an example here. And again, we just broadly want to know where it's located, is it improved, what is the current cover or topography, and then just to highlight or note any features such as streams or water bodies or agricultural lands that may be on the property, and then what is the general land use of the surrounding properties. The next section in the application is project eligibility, and this is fairly self-explanatory. What's changed here is that if a property was the site of multiple battles, and this is particularly, I think, relevant for Civil War battles, we only want you to select one battlefield to use for the application. And we recommend that you select the battle that has the highest priority rating and or the property that has the most acreage in the core area of, I'm sorry, the battle with the most core acreage. All subsequent evaluation of the application and scoring will be based on that one battlefield. And I know depending on the regions in which you work, sometimes there is a given property that crosses 3, 4, even 5 battles. And we used to ask you to provide information on all of those. Now we just want you to select one, and we recommend you select the one with the highest priority rating because that the scoring is directly connected to that. Nothing's really changed for the Revolutionary War or War of 1812 projects. And in general, we want a brief summary description of the battle, and to the degree you know, we really like to understand what happened on the particular subject tract or subject property and how that maybe contributes to the larger significance of the battle. But to the degree you can tell us what happened or why this particular piece of property was important to the larger battle, that would be great. The next section, section 5, is historic significance, and some of these questions have changed slightly, but in general, we want you to just note any historic battlefield features and sites that are man-made that are on the property, and that includes things like fortifications, roads, bridges, archaeological sites, historic buildings and structures, and things like that. We do, and pay attention when you're looking at the application. For some of these questions, we do ask that you attach some documentation that supports the presence of those features, and that could be a photograph, or perhaps an archaeological survey was done, or you have a historic map, or something like that, that you can submit with your application to show, to support the presence of those features. We also want to know what we're calling the historic battlefield terrain, and we just want you to describe the existing natural terrain of the property, and any topographic features that help to define the landscape. And here, just, broadly think about ground cover, waterways, knolls or ridges, swales, marshes, and drainages. If those features are still present, and particularly if they were important to the overall activity of the battle, that would be important to note here. If there are any non-battlefield resources on the property that are also historic, such as a building, we'd love for you to note that. And also any underrepresented historic resources. And here we're looking for you to describe any resources on the property that are associated with Virginia's culturally diverse or underrepresented communities. And finally, we used to ask you to sort of list every building and structure on the property, and we no longer are asking that, but we just generally want to know what modern resources are on the property. And for us, that's really anything constructed or installed after 1973. And we ask this question primarily because, to the extent that the property is compromised by modern improvements, we may ask an applicant to rehabilitate the property and remove some of those modern features, potentially within a certain time frame, and to execute a related management plan. Next, we have section 6 and 7. Section 6 is additional conservation values, and here we're just asking you to check yes or no if the property fronts or adjoins, things like scenic byways or scenic rivers. And in the grant manual, we're going to provide a list of some web links and resources to more easily allow you to check whether your property sort of hits any of these designations. We also want to know, how close is the property to other conserved lands? And again, we've previously asked, but we would like a map showing the relationship of the property to other conserved lands. And then again, we just check the box and let us know whether the property is within any of the Conserve Virginia categories or layers. And the application form has a link to the Conserve Virginia database, where you can upload a shapefile of your property if you have it, and check those layers, or you can navigate by using the property address. So we don't need a map or anything. We just want you to check the box if your property falls within any of those layers. Public access is an important component of the application and the scoring. And again, this is derived primarily from the language of the legislation that talks about the public interest. And so initially, we want you to indicate what public access will result from the project, considering the number of days per year that the property will be open and accessible to the general public. Specifically now, we want you to identify if you have plans for site improvements to facilitate public access. We're asking you to sort of list those with an estimated timeline in terms of a start date and a completion date, and whether or not you've completed or started any of that yet. And for this, we just want you to consider things like signs or kiosks, trails, roadside pull-offs, restrooms, things like that. And again, this is an sort of estimated timeline with a projected start date and a projected completion date. But we're looking for some specificity as to what you're planning for this particular property if you are planning improvements to facilitate public access. Public interest section continues, so we're still in section 7. These questions here, where it's under a subsection other public access, this is where we're looking for information on how the property may be accessible to the public beyond just physical public access. And these questions are designed to connect directly to those specific terms that were in the legislation regarding orderly community development and heritage tourism and community impact. So the first question we just ask what other activities you're going to do to make information about this property available to the public, and that's things like website development and lesson plans, public education kits, things like that. We want you to identify the communities that will be impacted by the project, and that could be anything from descendant communities to local preservation organizations, adjacent neighborhoods, friends groups, schools. It may only be one community, there may be multiple communities. Current community support, instead of asking for letters of support, we've reworked this into a question where we ask you to just describe the current community support for the project. Note which communities have been involved and how they will continue to remain involved once the project is implemented. So if you're acquiring the property in fee and you have plans to give battlefield tours and the local friends group supports the project and is going to help you do that, that's the kind of information we're looking for with this question. And the last two questions are related to research opportunities and heritage tourism, and we've asked you to describe how this project will further research opportunities and to identify any areas of focus. Back to the prior example I gave about the United States Colored Troops, that might be a particular area of focus that your organization is going to highlight, and you're going to conduct further research on, you know, which units or which soldiers or what actions occurred. That would be something we're looking for here. And then heritage tourism is just how acquisition of the property or placing it under easement will help to develop and stimulate heritage tourism. Section 8 is uses and treatment of the property, and not much has changed in this section from prior grant rounds. What's important here is we really want to understand the current uses of the property, be they residential or agricultural, and how those uses will change if the grant funding is awarded. We want to understand your plans for stewardship of the property and how you intend to treat the historic resources, even the battlefield landscape, or if there are historic buildings on the property, whether they're related or not to the battle, what are your plans for those? If you are thinking about battlefield restoration or rehabilitation, we have a question related to that. And if you're not, then you know that question is not applicable. We also want to know your plans if there are any natural resources on the property that are significant, like streams and rivers. What are your plans for those with regard to buffering or forest management plans or agricultural management plans, things like that. And finally, the last question is related to your stewardship approach for the battlefield properties that are already under your care, and if you can give us an example. Here we're looking for things like how often are you monitoring Do you do cleanup days? What is the relationship like with your tenants? Are they aware the property's conserved? Things like that. So if you can provide any examples of stewardship activities you've implemented on other properties, that would be ideal. Sections 9 and 10 are related to threat and legal matters. You all will be happy to know that the legal matters section has been shortened substantially. And because of the easement application process being required, we are no longer asking for title work and title commitments and things like that with the Battlefield grant application. So for threat, again, we want to know, is it listed for sale? Has it been listed for sale in the past 12 months? And please, please, please attach documentation, whether that's an MLS listing or a real estate listing, something that lets the reviewer know that this property was listed for sale. If the property is threatened by development, we also want to know that. And again, there's been some shifts in Virginia, as we all know, and now we're looking a lot at industrial scale solar farms, data warehouse centers, also still large scale residential subdivisions or infrastructure projects. Let us know if any of those will specifically impact this property, and please attach whatever documentation you can to sort of show that that process is happening and that threat is imminent. We also ask you to explain how the project mitigates the proposed threat and for you to describe the nature, extent, and severity of the threat. And again, we really want, as to the degree you can, to be specific to this particular property and how that threat is imminent. And again, that will tie directly back to how the application is scored. Legal matters is more a little more narrative informed, but we just want to know from you if there are any title defects or other issues that need to be resolved. We want you to just tell us about the current condition of the property and has anything changed since your easement application was reviewed by the Easement Acceptance Committee. You know, as an example, maybe there's a house on the property and the water meter broke and you had to install a new water line and that involved ground disturbance. That would be something to note here. If nothing's changed, then it's okay to write nothing's changed. And finally, and really important, we want to know that the project is consistent with the current comprehensive plan in effect for the locality in which the property is located. And we do want you to attach correspondence from a planning official noting that the easement is consistent with the plan. There's a section on budget, which is pretty self-explanatory. You just need to complete the table and identify in the other field if there are costs that we haven't listed. Just note those for us and then identify the sources of match and the status of that match. And finally, section 12 is organizational capacity, and these questions are different this year, so I've highlighted them a little bit more here. The first question is for you to list the desired goals, results, and outcomes of the project, and that is intended to be really concise, really short. And an example here is, you know, number 1 is acquire the property, 2 is provide for public access through trails and signage, 3 is install a roadside pull-off, 4 is connect the property to an existing greenway, and 5 is we're looking for you to communicate to us pretty clearly and concisely. The next question is how your organization will manage the project to completion. And again, I've provided an example here, but you know, things like which staff member is going to work on it. Is that person going to work with your stewardship staff? How is your legal review going to happen? You know, how are you going to install your signage with budget constraints, things like that. We really want to know your plan to get this project done and get the easement recorded. And finally, we've asked for an estimated timeline for the project. And again, we understand this is estimated, but we want to have a sense that you have a plan for getting it done. And I've included an example table here with the activity, the start date, completion date, and status, everything from acquiring the property to posting information on your website about it, putting in a walking path, then installing signs, drafting the easement and going through the legal review, and then recording the easement. And that's probably going to be the biggest chunk of time in the process. But in general, if you have estimated a timeline or estimated start and finish dates for these steps, that's what we want to know. The other questions are, if you're submitting multiple applications, please let us know if you have a priority in terms of which ones are most important for you to get funded, and then whether or not the proposal's previously been submitted to the Battlefield Fund. And then there will be a checklist at the end of the application, and that will sort of identify what is a required attachment and then optional attachments and supplemental information, which we will limit. And I don't know yet whether that might be 3 pages or 5 pages, but the checklist will sort of make clear to you what you have to include with your application and what you can include as additional information. I am running short on time, so I want to get to just quickly some tips that we've written out for a successful application. Really important to reach out to all your grant funders and project partners early in the process. And we, DHR, we are happy to talk with your other grant funders, whether they're federal or if you have state grants also coming in as part of the project. And it's important to understand whether any of the grant requirements conflict and can deliverables be combined. If every grant requires a survey, you don't need to do 3 surveys, obviously. And it really importantly is how to align the timelines for all of these grant programs, which I know can be tricky, but it's important to sort of communicate early in the process. We definitely recommend you review the grant program and the property protection requirements, particularly the easement requirement. And if you're not familiar with it, we recommend you ask us to see a sample easement or another recorded easement. Carefully read the grant manual, because from grant round to grant round, things change in the application and in the grant manual. And please ask questions if you're not sure about something. Attend workshops, which you all are doing. And then again, answer narrative questions about the project, the objectives and goals clearly and concisely. We really want only the information requested, and the more specific you can be about the project, the better. And we also recommend that you have someone unfamiliar with the project review your application, because our review panel doesn't know your project as well as you do. And sometimes it helps to have an objective reviewer look at it before you submit that application. And finally, we will notify you, and this is sort of a new step for us this year. We will notify you when we receive your application. And if for any reason it's incomplete, we will let you know and give you 2 business days to correct or rectify that. And generally this will be for administrative errors. You forgot an attachment, you forgot to attach the MLS listing, or it wasn't part of the packet, things like that. But we will definitely notify you and let you know you have 2 days to get us whatever is missing, and then your application will be considered complete. Sorry, I am running out of time. So question and answer. I know we're short, and I'm sorry about that. I can hang on a little longer for folks if they have questions, but I think we'll jump right into that now. And for anybody who has to leave and can't stay, I will share the PowerPoint with all of the attendees that registered for the event. It is large, so I'm going to have to reduce the file size to do that. So the pictures may be not great, but the content will be there. And I will plan to do that. So you should at least get a copy of the PowerPoint. And if you have questions, reach out to me, and my contact information is at the end of the PowerPoint. Okay, Carrie, questions? Any questions?
We don't have anything in the chat or any raised hands.
No.
Does that mean that you covered everything in such detail that all their questions are answered?
I guess so. Can't see if anybody's raising their hand.
Okay.
Okay. I should have.
Did Joseph Abel have a question?
Yeah, hi, thanks. I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. You said under the legal section of the application that title work and title commitments are no longer required attachments. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Theoretically, or not theoretically, that will be part of your easement application. So you don't need to repeat that anymore for this grant application.
Thanks.
You're welcome. I should on. Nobody else has any questions?
No one else?
I'm going to put up the next slide. Well, don't everybody email me all at once afterward. Most of, I don't know everybody who registered, but please feel free to contact Carrie Richardson with any questions about the easement program or that easement review that's required. She is our easement program specialist, and she can help walk you through any review processes related to that. And if you have questions about the Battlefield Fund or the application process, then please reach out to me directly. And I'll be happy to answer what I know and try to get answers to anything I don't. Well, I will do a last call for quick. Go ahead.
Joseph Abel has raised his hand again.
Yeah, regarding the new easement requirement, application requirement, June 16th is the deadline for getting the apps in, and July 17th is the meeting date. Will y'all be providing the letters that are required to attach to the application before the deadline?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we'll get those to you quickly.
Great.
And it's okay if that letter says you have to look into these issues before it can be approved. That's fine. Still submit your grant application. We just want to know that that review has happened.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else?
I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, Wendy, I think that's it.
Well, I'm not familiar with Teams well enough to stop sharing to show myself, but I can't. Technology is not my friend. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and we really appreciate it. And our goal here is to be transparent and to work with you. So, you know, again, the door is open anytime you have a question or want to chat. And thank you, Carrie, for your help. And thankfully we can see you even if we can't see me.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.